The chamber fell into an uneasy silence, the kind of silence that doesn't just arrive, it takes over. Cameras locked in, journalists leaned forward, and the air thickened with anticipation. Then, from the polished wood of his desk, Senator Mitt Romney straightened his shoulders and leaned into the microphone. His voice cut like glass across the room. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, deliberate and cold, "what makes you think you're even qualified to be here?" The words didn't just sting, they carried weight, the kind of weight designed to diminish, to reduce a rising voice into nothing more than a footnote. It was a line crafted for the record, a challenge not only to Crockett herself, but to anyone who dared to defy the hierarchy of American politics. A ripple ran through the chamber. Some smirked, others looked away, but everyone knew this was the moment. The contrast was almost cinematic. Romney, the seasoned veteran, a figure carved from decades of establishment politics, staring down a freshman congresswoman whose career was still in its infancy. He exuded the confidence of someone who believed power was his birthright. She, sitting quietly, held the calm defiance of someone who knew she had clawed her way into the very space he questioned. Viewers across the country watching live felt the insult land. For some, it echoed the dismissive tone they had heard in classrooms, boardrooms, and workplaces where they too had been told they didn't belong. The chamber wasn't just a chamber anymore. It was a mirror of every moment America's marginalized voices had been challenged, belittled, or underestimated. Romney folded his hands, satisfied with his strike. The silence lingered, waiting to be broken. Crockett's eyes didn't waver. She leaned back slightly, as if measuring the moment, as if calculating the exact angle to strike back. And in that stillness, something remarkable took shape. A tension that would not end with words alone, but with a response that would echo far beyond these walls. Because what happened next would leave not just Mitt Romney, but an entire chamber, and the internet, absolutely speechless. But before her response shook the nation, we need to understand how this battle of respect and power even began. Tension didn't just hang in the room, it pulsed through it. The chamber, already split along invisible lines, reflected the division of a country grappling with its own identity. On one side stood the old guard, voices rooted in decades of tradition, privilege, and unchallenged authority. On the other, newer representatives like Jasmine Crockett, whose very presence symbolized change that many welcomed, but just as many feared. Romney's challenge wasn't just a question. It was a test, the kind of test meant to expose weakness and remind everyone of who supposedly belonged and who didn't. He spoke with the assurance of legacy, the confidence of a man who had run for president, governed a state, and worn the mantle of respectability in Washington for longer than Crockett had practiced law. To him, political legitimacy was earned through years, through gray hair and long resumes, not through fresh voices rising from communities long ignored. But Crockett wasn't just any freshman congresswoman. She represented something much larger. Her election was a statement that Americans were ready for new stories, new fighters, new advocates who didn't simply inherit power, but earned it against the odds. For millions watching, her seat was proof that barriers could be broken, that identity and authenticity could carry as much weight as pedigree and lineage. And that made Romney's words sting with more than condescension. They carried the echo of every time a young, ambitious, or marginalized voice had been told they weren't enough. The stakes of this clash reached beyond the walls of Congress. It was generational politics unfolding live. Romney embodied an era where power was consolidated, where experience alone was a shield from accountability. Crockett embodied an America in transition, where fresh perspectives weren't a threat but a necessity, where diversity wasn't just a checkbox but the lifeblood of a democracy striving to live up to its ideals. And this wasn't just about Crockett and Romney as individuals. It was about the collision of two Americas, one that clings to tradition and gatekeeping, and another that insists on redefining who gets to speak, who gets to lead, and who gets to belong. Their exchange wasn't scripted theater. It was the raw expression of that deeper struggle. Every glance in the chamber, every whisper in the press gallery reflected that tension. Was this going to be another moment where the establishment crushed a newcomer? Or would it turn into something far greater? A turning point where the old narrative cracked under the pressure of truth delivered without apology. Crockett's silence, her refusal to flinch, told its own story. She wasn't intimidated, she wasn't shaken, and for those who knew her history, for those who had followed her rise from community advocate to congresswoman, that stillness was the calm before a storm. Because what mattered now wasn't just her qualifications, her record, or her experience. What mattered was how she would answer the unspoken question hanging in the air. Does the new America truly belong here? Every second ticked louder. The nation watched. Romney smirked. And Crockett waited, unhurried, patient, not because she lacked an answer, but because she knew the power of timing. And yet, nobody could have predicted the calm, devastating response she was about to deliver. To understand the weight of Romney's challenge, one has to understand the man behind it. Mitt Romney was no ordinary senator. He was a figure whose name had been etched into the granite of American politics for decades, a man who carried the polish of a presidential candidate, the prestige of a governor, and the authority of a long-serving legislator. He was, in many ways, the archetype of the establishment, silver-haired, articulate, and measured, the kind of leader many older Americans saw as the model of dignity in public life. Romney's aura was cultivated carefully over years in the public eye. He had been governor of Massachusetts, a state where Republicans rarely thrived. He had stood on the debate stage in 2012 as the Republican Party's nominee for president, delivering rehearsed lines with the calmness of a seasoned executive. And in the Senate, he had carved a role for himself as the rare Republican willing to step out of line, earning moments of praise from moderates who saw him as a statesman willing to buck his party when conscience demanded. But behind that veneer of statesmanship lay something else, a streak of arrogance, subtle but unmistakable, that revealed itself whenever he felt his authority was being questioned. His reputation for polished civility often masked a sharper instinct, to diminish voices he saw as inexperienced, untested, or unworthy of his level. He was the seasoned professor shaking his head at the freshman's question, the executive sighing at the intern's bold suggestion. And for every time he broke with his party in dramatic fashion, there were other moments when his condescension toward younger or more progressive figures exposed the contradictions in his character. It was a contradiction that defined him. On one hand, Romney liked to see himself as the conscience of the GOP, the moral compass pointing north when his party loads sent its way. On the other hand, he had no patience for those who hadn't paid their dues, those who dared to climb the ranks without following the same well-trodden path he had walked. To him, power was something inherited or earned through elite struggle, not seized by newcomers who came armed with passion, lived experience, and a hunger for justice. This attitude wasn't always loud, but it was consistent. He could dismiss an idea without raising his voice, reduce an argument with a smirk, and frame his opponents as naive with just a choice word. In debate after debate, interview after interview, Romney used the same tool: calm dismissal disguised as wisdom. And in a chamber like the Senate, where the appearance of composure can carry as much weight as policy, it often worked. But there was a blind spot in his calculation. The very qualities he dismissed in others, youth, passion, authenticity, lived experience, were the qualities the country was beginning to demand. America was changing, and while Romney still believed in the hierarchy of experience, the nation outside those marble halls was demanding voices that looked and sounded more like Jasmine Crockett. And so, when Romney leaned into his microphone and questioned Crockett's qualifications, he was not simply asking for a resume. He was enacting a ritual that had long sustained the old order of American politics, the gatekeeping of legitimacy. It was a move he had used before and one that had worked countless times. But this time it would not land as he expected. Because Romney, for all his polish, failed to see the shifting tide. He failed to notice that what once looked like arrogance disguised as wisdom now appeared as condescension exposed by contrast. His calm dismissal, once mistaken for dignity, now came across as brittle elitism. The very thing that had made him untouchable for decades was about to become the weakness that left him unprepared for the storm about to break. He appeared powerful, yes, the elder statesman with the resume, the gravitas, the unshakable demeanor. But power in politics is not only about presence, it is about perception. And perception was beginning to turn against him. To those watching, the smirk, The tone, the carefully chosen question didn't look like wisdom anymore. It looked like arrogance. It looked like fear of a new generation rising. Romney didn't know it yet, but in that moment the hierarchy he represented was cracking. He thought this would be another easy dismissal, another reminder of who held the authority in Washington. Instead, it became the setup for a reversal so sharp, so unforgettable, that his carefully constructed aura would not shield him. But Crockett's story was nothing like Romney imagined, and that's where his downfall began. To truly grasp the weight of Jasmine Crockett's silence in that chamber, the stillness before her answer, one must understand the path that brought her there. Because Crockett was not born into privilege, nor was her seat in Congress a gift of political dynasty. Her journey was one of grit, resistance, and relentless service, forged not in ivy-covered halls of legacy, but in courtrooms and neighborhoods where justice was too often denied. Long before she was Congresswoman Crockett, she was Attorney Crockett, a defender of those who couldn't defend themselves. Her legal career wasn't built around high-paying corporate clients or cushy boardrooms. It was forged in community defense, where cases weren't glamorous, but they mattered. Lives, families, futures depended on whether someone like her would fight. Time after time, she walked into courtrooms where the odds were stacked against her clients, where systemic inequities loomed large, and where the easy choice would have been to stay quiet, to play along. But Crockett was never wired for silence. She carried that defiance like armor. In the courtroom, when prosecutors tried to paint her clients as irredeemable, she pushed back with precision and fire. In community meetings, when officials shrugged at injustice, she spoke with the kind of passion that shook the room. And in each battle, she built a reputation. Underestimated, yes, but underestimated always at the opponent's peril. Her activism stretched beyond the courtroom. Crockett marched. She organized. She stood at the front lines when communities demanded accountability. She didn't just talk about justice. She lived it, often at personal cost. Nights bled into mornings, case files piled high, and the stress of carrying other people's battles could have broken a lesser spirit. But she refused to let it. Because every time someone tried to dismiss her, too young, too bold, too direct, it only added fuel to her fire. What pushed her into politics wasn't ambition for power. It was necessity. After years of watching systemic problems recycle through her cases, Crockett realized that the courtroom alone could not fix what was broken. To change laws, to rewrite the rules, she had to step into the arena where laws were made. For her, Congress wasn't the prize. It was the next battlefield. And it wasn't easy. The establishment didn't open doors for people like Jasmine Crockett. They tested her. They dismissed her. They whispered that she didn't belong, that she was too raw or too confrontational. But she didn't back down. She ran on authenticity, on lived experience, on the unapologetic belief that America's halls of power should not be the exclusive domain of the privileged few. And when voters sent her to Washington, it wasn't because she had the most money or the fanciest endorsements. It was because people saw in her a reflection of themselves, hardworking, overlooked, but unwilling to bow. Every speech she gave, every stance she took in Congress came from that foundation. She wasn't there by accident. She was not there because someone handed her a title. She was there because she fought her way into the room, carrying with her the voices of communities that had been silenced for too long. This resilience, this refusal to yield, became her defining quality. And it unnerved those who were used to the old order. Crockett's presence alone challenged the idea that only certain backgrounds, certain pedigrees could lead. For people who had been told all their lives to stay in their place, her rise was proof that staying silent was no longer an option. It's why Romney's words struck such a chord. When he leaned into the microphone and asked her what made her think she was qualified to be there, he wasn't just speaking to her. He was speaking to every underdog, every immigrant family, every young leader who had ever clawed their way toward legitimacy only to be told they were unworthy. But Crockett, unlike so many before her, was ready to answer that question in a way no one would forget. Her journey had trained her for this moment. The courtroom battles, the activism, the constant dismissal, the long nights spent preparing to defend people who had been written off. It all led here. Where others might crumble under the weight of condescension, Crockett thrived. She knew the sting of being underestimated, and she knew how to turn it into strength. Now, as Romney smirked and the chamber held its breath, Crockett wasn't just one congresswoman facing one senator. She was the embodiment of a larger struggle, a living reminder that progress doesn't ask for permission. It demands its place. And now, facing Romney's condescension, every step of her journey was about to erupt in one unforgettable response. The silence after Romney's first strike didn't last long. He leaned forward again, unwilling to let the moment drift away. His tone sharpened, each word laced with the authority of years. Experience matters, Congresswoman. We cannot allow inexperience to dictate the course of this nation. It takes decades to understand the weight of these decisions. You have yet earned that seat. The words weren't shouted, but they carried the sting of finality, the kind of dismissal that sought to define Crockett before she could define herself. He spoke as though the question of her legitimacy had already been settled, as if her presence was an oversight soon to be corrected. The chamber hummed with whispers, eyes darting between the seasoned senator and the congresswoman whose composure remained unshaken. Romney pressed harder, drawing from his arsenal of history and tenure. This is not a place for experiments, for untested voices. This chamber demands wisdom earned through years of service, through scars, through lessons learned in battles you haven't yet fought. We cannot substitute enthusiasm for experience. He paused, letting the words hang like a verdict. This isn't personal, it's reality. But the reality Romney described felt different to those watching. To some, it sounded like the same gatekeeping rhetoric that had been used for generations to shut out fresh ideas, diverse voices, and those who hadn't traveled the same well-worn paths. The older senator's words dripped with the assurance of tradition, but that assurance carried an unmistakable undertone: fear. Crockett sat still, her eyes fixed on Romney. She did not interrupt. She did not flinch. She listened, and with each sentence he stacked against her, the tension in the room thickened. It was the silence before a storm, the stillness of an audience waiting for the moment when patience transforms into power. The cinematic weight of the moment was undeniable. Every heartbeat in the chamber seemed amplified. Reporters' pens hovered above their notepads but did not move. Even senators accustomed to the endless rhythm of debates and speeches leaned slightly forward, sensing that something more than a routine exchange was unfolding. Romney, misreading her compose. "Your as weakness," continued. "We respect your passion, but passion without experience is dangerous. This nation cannot be led by sound bites and sentiment. It demands leaders who understand the cost of every word, the history behind every decision." His voice grew steadier, his confidence building as he doubled down. "That is what leadership requires, and with all due respect, Congresswoman, it is something you simply have not yet earned." The implication was clear. Crockett was an imposter, a temporary guest in a chamber meant for real leaders. Romney believed he was cornering her, tightening the narrative until she had no room to escape. He underestimated her silence, mistaking restraint for defeat. But the audience, both inside and watching beyond, began to feel something shift. Crockett's calmness wasn't weakness, it was calculation. Her stillness radiated patience, as though she were allowing Romney to construct his own trap, word by word, until the weight of his condescension became undeniable. In that chamber, the clash had transcended politics. It became theater, history, and generational struggle colliding in one exchange. The elder statesman piling the past on top of her shoulders, and the younger voice choosing to carry it silently until the exact right moment to set it down. Every second of her silence raised the stakes higher. Each phrase Romney added only sharpened the contrast between old power and new resilience. The heartbeat of the room grew louder, not from fear of her collapse, but from anticipation of her inevitable rise. Then, as Romney finished his litany of experience and leaned back with the smugness of a man convinced he had won, Crockett finally moved. She leaned into the microphone, steady, unhurried, her voice waiting to be released, and the chamber held its breath. The microphone was inches from her lips, and the chamber had gone utterly still. For a moment, Jasmine Crockett didn't speak. She let the silence expand, let it do the work of heightening the tension. The pause was deliberate, a tactic honed in courtrooms, where silence could be just as devastating as speech. Her gaze swept across the room, lingering on Romney just long enough for everyone to feel the weight of what was coming. Then, with a calmness that seemed almost surgical, she began, "Senator Romney, you ask what makes me qualified to be here." Her tone was measured, deliberate. "I am qualified because I have spent my career doing what this body often talks about but rarely accomplishes, standing up for people who had no one else to stand for them." The words hung in the air, firm without being raised, confident without arrogance. She leaned back slightly, giving her opponent, and the entire chamber, time to process. "I didn't arrive in this seat because of legacy, or because a powerful family name cleared the way. I got here because I fought for communities you've never had to set foot in, because I defended people who couldn't afford the kind of justice that money buys. I didn't just study policy from an ivory tower. I lived the consequences of policy on the ground." Her words struck with precision. The murmurs began, faint but audible. Crockett pressed on, each line a scalpel cutting through layers of entitlement. "You say experience matters, and it does. But experience is not measured only in years. It is measured in battles fought, in voices defended, in lives protected. My experience comes from the courtroom, where mothers prayed that someone would believe their children deserved fairness. My experience comes from walking into neighborhoods where government had long forgotten its promises. My experience comes from being told, time and again, that I didn't belong, and proving those people wrong." She paused again. Romney shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His confident smirk faltered, replaced by a twitch of unease. "Senator, with all due respect, your kind of experience is not the only kind that counts. Serving boardrooms and debating in think tanks does not outweigh standing in the trenches with people who had no voice. Years in office are meaningless if they are not matched with years of service to those left out of the conversation. And if you think that being new to this chamber makes me unqualified, then maybe it's this chamber that has forgotten what qualification really means." The room stirred. Some senators leaned in. Others glanced at one another nervously, as though suddenly aware of being witnesses to a shift in power. The narrative Romney had tried to shape was crumbling, and everyone could see it. Crockett's voice strengthened. "I represent a generation of leaders who were told to wait their turn, told to be grateful for scraps, told that change was dangerous, that passion was a liability. But, Senator, the truth is this. The people I serve can't afford to wait another 30 years for the establishment to decide they're ready. They need leaders now. Leaders who don't flinch when confronted. Leaders who don't bow when challenged. Leaders who understand that legitimacy doesn't come from titles but from trust." Her words carried the weight of every courtroom cross-examination she had ever delivered, every rally speech she had ever given. This was not just a rebuttal, it was a dismantling. "You want to talk about scars?" she continued, her voice firm but unshaken. "I have scars too. They may not come from political campaigns, but they come from fighting a justice system that wasn't designed to protect people like me or the communities I serve. They come from standing in front of judges who looked at me the way you are looking at me now, as if my presence was a mistake, and yet, every time I proved I belonged. That is my experience. That is my qualification." The murmurs grew louder, rippling through the chamber. Reporters scribbled furiously, aware that a moment destined for headlines was unfolding. Romney sat stiff, his practiced composure slipping into something else. Discomfort, even disbelief. Crockett lowered her voice, almost to a whisper, forcing the room to lean in. "So, Senator, if you're asking why I'm here, it's simple. I am here because the people sent me here. And their voice, their trust, their mandate is my qualification. And no amount of your dismissal can erase that." The chamber erupted, not with applause but with something far more dramatic. Silence. A silence so profound it spoke louder than any cheer. It was the silence of realization, the silence of a room that had just witnessed a balance of power tilt in real time. Romney swallowed hard, shifting in his chair. For the first time in years, the elder statesman looked speechless. His lips parted slightly, as if to form a rebuttal, but no words came. Crockett's words had landed with the weight of inevitability, leaving him grasping for footing that no longer existed. And Crockett, sensing the moment, didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She simply leaned back from the microphone, her expression steady, her silence saying more than words ever could. The dynamic had shifted. What began as Romney's attempt to put a freshman congresswoman in her place had backfired spectacularly. The chamber was no longer looking at Crockett as a newcomer out of her depth. They were looking at her as something else entirely, a force. The moment crystallized into something cinematic. Cameras captured Romney's discomfort, Crockett's poise, and the unmistakable tension that filled the chamber. It wasn't just a clash of words. It was the passing of a torch, the collision of two eras, and the triumph of a new kind of leadership. In that instant, Crockett had not only defended herself, she had redefined what it meant to belong. But the real explosion wouldn't happen inside Congress. It was about to erupt online. By the time the chamber adjourned that night, the real battleground had already shifted to the digital world. Within minutes of Crockett's words slicing through the silence, phones lit up across the nation. In the days after the exchange, when the headlines had cooled and the memes had begun their natural drift into the endless churn of the internet, Crockett chose her moment carefully. Standing before a crowd in her home district, she didn't revel in the takedown. She reframed it. With the same calm tone she carried in the Senate chamber, she looked out at her audience and said, "Experience isn't about years in power. It's about years in service." The words landed with quiet force. No flourish, no theatrics, just truth. She spoke about the mothers who juggled 3 jobs while still finding time to volunteer at school boards. She spoke of immigrants who built entire neighborhoods with calloused hands and undying hope. She reminded the crowd that service didn't require a title, that dignity wasn't tied to seniority, and that truth was not the possession of the powerful, but the inheritance of the people. It wasn't a rejection of age or experience. It was a call to redefine them. Crockett painted a vision of leadership rooted not in how long someone had held office, but in how deeply they had touched lives. "A resume can list positions," she said, "but it can never capture compassion. Power can open doors, but only service keeps them open for the next person who comes through." The moral cut through the noise. Arrogance, elitism, and gatekeeping may intimidate in the moment, but they cannot outlast the steady, relentless work of dignity and truth. Crockett embodied that lesson, and in doing so, she gave it back to every underdog who had ever been told to wait their turn. Across the nation, her message resonated with those who had long felt invisible. For young women navigating male-dominated workplaces, it was a reminder that worth wasn't determined by who doubted them. For immigrants carrying stories of sacrifice, it was validation that their lived experiences held equal weight to any polished resume. For students, activists, and everyday workers, it was a charge to value their own service, their own fight, their own voice. Romney's attempt to belittle had become, ironically, the spotlight for something bigger. By questioning Crockett's qualifications, he had given her the stage to redefine the very meaning of qualification itself. And she had done so not with anger, but with clarity, not with venom, but with vision. The crowd listening to her that day rose to their feet, applause rolling like thunder. They weren't cheering just for her. They were cheering for themselves, for every barrier that had ever been placed before them, for every doubt that had ever been cast their way. Crockett had turned condescension into a creed, that service is the truest qualification of all. And as the applause carried on, as cameras captured the moment that would echo far beyond that hall, one truth became undeniable. The underdogs had claimed their victory. The overlooked had seized their validation. The new voices had made themselves heard, and they weren't going back to silence. Crockett didn't just win an exchange in a Senate chamber. She redefined what leadership could mean for a generation daring to believe that dignity and service were stronger than arrogance and power. And for millions watching, it felt less like a resolution and more like a beginning.